In this Magic the Gathering pre-release guide, I will be covering all of the information you need to know before attending your first pre-release. I will be discussing what is a pre-release basics you should know, and of course, strategy for beginners. First up, what is a pre-release? A pre-release is a sealed event where players get to play with cards from the newest MTG set for the first time. It is a fun, low-stakes tournament that players of all levels can enjoy. Now, what is a sealed event? In Sealed, players open 6 packs and use those cards plus basic lands to build 40 card decks. The format utilizes both deck building and gameplay skills, and cards of all rarities get to shine. So the example of some sorts of cards you might see in Sealed are small creatures, like a Grizzly Bears type thing. A 2-mana 2/2 is a very common stat line to see in Sealed. Big flyers as win conditions, like Air Elemental, 5-mana 4/4 flyer, just like big flyers at the top end of your curve. And then removal spells like Lightning Strike, 2-mana deal 3 is also a very typical card you would see in Sealed. You don't need high rarity cards, you open 6 packs, you're going to get 6 to 9 rares maybe in those packs, and then you're going to be building your deck with the cards you get, so lots of commons and uncommons get the chance to shine. Now, deck building in Sealed is the most complicated part of the format because you're building an entire deck starting off with just opening 6 packs. You are going to be building a 40 card deck. So if you're coming from Constructed, where you build with a 60 card deck, or you're coming from Commander, where you build a 100 card deck, you don't have to get that complicated. In Limited, you're going to be building a 40 card deck. You will be using 23 spells from the cards you opened. Don't worry, I will cover how to select those spells next. And then you're going to be using 17 lands. Basic lands are provided, so a 9/8 mana base is very common. So of the 6 packs that you're opening, you're going to be trying to identify 23 spells with which to build your deck, and then you can grab the basic lands from the land station at your local game store where you are playing. And if you do open non-basic lands, you can also include those in your deck as well. Next up, pre-release deck building steps. The first step is going to be open your packs and sort your cards by color, and then you can also group your colorless cards and multicolored cards into a separate pile. Next, you're going to sort each color into 3 tiers for power level. The tiers are Best, which are cards you actively want to play, Solid, which are cards you will always play when you're those colors are pretty much always going to play, and then Filler are cards you will sometimes play based on what your deck needs, or maybe if you have particular synergy packages included in your deck. We're going to cover those in a little bit more detail next. And then the final thing is you're going to pick your colors after you've done this sorting and build your deck. You have 2 goals during your deck build. First, you want to maximize the number of best cards that you are playing, and goal number 2 is minimize the number of filler cards you're playing. So you want to have high power level across the board, so playing a lot of solid cards, but you also want to make sure that you're playing the best cards you have available to you. So looking more into this card evaluation so we can talk about it a little bit more, the best cards are cards you actively want to play. These are the cards that are going to be game winners. These are going to be your most powerful rares that you open. These are the best removal spells that you've opened. These are cards that you are like opening them and you say, oh, I hope I can make this card fit into my final deck. The next tier are the solid cards. These are cards you will always play, but they're not necessarily pushing you into that particular color. It's going to be like a solid creature or a solid removal spell, but nothing like too crazy in terms of efficiency. Just the cards that you're like, well, if I'm playing a blue deck, this card is going to be making the cut. And you like having these cards because it's like, okay, these cards are solid. I'm never going to be unhappy playing these cards. Then there's the filler cards, which are cards you will sometimes play. Sometimes they're a little bit inefficient. Maybe it's a removal spell that costs a couple more mana than you'd like, or it's a creature that's a little bit inefficient but fills a particular role in your deck. Maybe your deck just needs another big threat and this card can get the job done, but you aren't always going to be playing it. And then there's bad cards, which are cards you should rarely play. You can oftentimes put these cards into a pile off to the side. Sometimes it's a rare that's only got constructed applications, or it's a card that just didn't hit the mark on its design, or just a card that you don't think you want to play, and you can put it off to the side so it doesn't distract you when you're making your build decisions. So once you've done your sealed sorting, it should look something like this. You've got your colors all in a line, and then you've got your best cards, your solid cards, your filler cards going down the row. So you can kind of get a sense just by looking at it where your best cards lie, where your most solid cards are, and then maybe you can eliminate some colors right off the bat, or know, okay, I'm definitely wanting to play red in this pool or something like that. Now, when making build decisions, here are the things that should be on your mind. First up, power level. We already discussed it. You want to maximize the number of your best cards you're playing while minimizing the number of your filler cards you're playing. It is also worth noting that individual card quality is usually more important than synergy, because in sealed, since you're at the mercy of what you're opening, it's hard to enable cards that require a lot of synergy pieces to be built around. So if there's a card that really needs you to have a lot of +1/+1 counters, or needs you to have a lot of creature token generation, you might just not open the synergies to support that card, whereas a card that's individually very powerful, like a just top-end bomb that has a lot of abilities, is oftentimes going to get better in sealed when compared to other formats, because synergy is going to be harder to come by. Next up, removal spells. Removal is a key part of the sealed format. Your opponents are going to play cards that you really have to deal with, and games have a tendency to go long where you're going to be sitting in these board stalls where maybe only 1 or 2 creatures each person has matters, and removal is really important. So prioritizing colors that have good removal is important for sealed and something to consider. And then 3, mana curve. If you don't know what mana curve is, it basically means you want to have enough things to do in the early game and enough things to do in the late game, though early game is oftentimes the one that gets neglected. So making sure you have cheap plays is also important, because you will occasionally face aggressive decks in sealed. Now, talking more about the mana curve, in case you've never heard of the concept, it's basically something that looks like this. You want to have more cheap plays than expensive plays. It's not usually going to look exactly like this, but this kind of graphic is just meant to illustrate cheap plays are important because you need to be making sure you're affecting the game in the early stages so you don't fall behind and have to use your cards inefficiently, where if you just can play early plays, trade them off with your opponent's early plays, then you can survive to the late game. Whereas if one player has early plays and is able to apply pressure while the other person does nothing or doesn't make any impactful plays on the board, they can pull ahead and force the opponent into situations where they're using their cards suboptimally. So cheap plays are important, but they aren't everything, especially in sealed where games can be a bit slower. Gameplay can be slow, so look for early plays that stay relevant in the late game to help you win top deck battles, because a lot of sealed games come down to a board stall where you're both just drawing your spell for the turn and hoping that it's something that can help swing the game in your favor. And so drawing a useless 2/2 creature that's just not going to have any relevant abilities for the late game can be a pretty big downside. So having early plays that can affect the game late as well are really nice. So that could be a early creature that has an activated ability that costs a lot of mana. So if you draw it later, you can have the mana to activate its ability. It could be an early creature that has evasion, like flying, so that when you draw it later, it can chip in for damage in a board stall. And it could also be just having cheap plays that are removal spells, because if you have cheap removal spells, you can use them to kill your opponent's early plays in the beginning of the game, and then you can use them to kill whatever creature is potentially problematic in the late game. And that's another reason why removal spells are really good in sealed, because of that early game to late game flexibility. And especially if you have enough removal spells, you can use that flexibility, whereas if you don't have enough removal spells, you maybe have to save them and be more conservative with how you're using them. Now, next up is splashing a color. In sealed, this is a very important aspect of the format. Splashing a color refers to when you're playing a base 2-color deck and then you're playing 1 or maybe 2 cards of a third color. So in sealed, this is a bit more of an advanced technique, but it does come up quite frequently, so I did want to cover it here. How to splash. The first thing you want to do is only splash cards with 1 color pip. So for example, if you're playing a blue-green deck, you could maybe splash a card that was like 5 blue-red to cast, because it's only got 1 red pip in the mana cost, whereas a card that has 2 red pips, it's going to be really prohibitively difficult to get that extra mana into your mana base to cast that red spell. The second thing is only splash late game cards. So for example, bombs or removal spells, because bombs are going to have a huge impact late and removal is going to scale into the game well. So if you are considering a splash, make sure the card has late game relevance, because one of the downsides of splashing is you might not be able to cast the card if you draw it early in the game, because it might take you a while to find your splash color or the lands you need to cast that splashed card. So make sure that you are prioritizing, if you are going to splash, only splashing late game cards. And then the general rule is 3 splash sources for 1 card. So a source would be something like a basic land that taps for that color. So if you were playing this blue-green deck that was splashing this late game red card, you would want to have 3 ways to tap for red mana. Now, oftentimes that's going to be something like a mountain. So that would be one of your sources. And then maybe you have a card that searches for a basic land, so it can go search up your mountain. So that would be a second source. And maybe you have one of the various lands that they print in many of these sets that can sacrifice itself to search for a basic land of any type and put it into play. So that could be you play your mountain and then you have a couple of ways to search up that mountain to get to your 3 sources. And if you're splashing multiple cards, like you generally are going to want to add 1 more source for every card that you're splashing in many cases. So if you're splashing like 2 cards, you'd want to have like 4 sources, something of that nature, though you don't really want to be going ambitious with splashing, especially when you are new. And then finally, minimize basic lands not in your main colors. One of the downsides of splashing is that it makes it harder to cast the spells that are in your main colors. So while it sometimes is necessary because you want to be playing a lot of your best cards, maybe you want to splash a good removal spell or a really good late game bomb or something like that, you still want to be able to cast your cards in the early stages of the game that are in your main colors. So try to minimize the basic lands not in your main colors. And as I already mentioned, one of the ways to do that is by having maybe one basic land of the land type that you are splashing, of color you are splashing, and then a couple of ways to search up that land or things of that nature. Dual lands can also be helpful for this. If you open a land that can tap for multiple colors, that can be a good way to enable splashes. And of course, with splashing, if you do not have the ability to get lands or search up lands, or you don't have tools in your pool to like search up basic lands, or you don't have the tools to splash, just don't splash. Try to build a consistent deck, because you don't want to lose games to just not being able to cast the spells in any of your colors, because maybe you put like 4 mountains in your deck and then you can't cast your blue-green spells, something like that. So make sure that you are splashing only in situations where it is justified. This is, as I said, a bit more of an advanced technique if you are new to pre-releases, but it is something that comes up quite frequently, because sometimes you're going to open a sealed pool where you have 2 colors with a lot of playables and you have a really good card and a 3rd color that you want to play. So I wanted to cover some of the basics of how to do that. Next up, final building tips. 1, make sure you have a plan. You want to have some sort of macro game plan when you are going into your deck build. As I said, synergy is going to be lower in a pre-release, but you still want to make sure that if you are going to be building a deck, you don't have a bunch of aggressive early creatures and then a bunch of really slow late game cards, because you're going to end up in a situation where you draw all of your slow late game cards at the beginning of the game and then draw all of your aggressive creatures at the end of the game once you've kind of gotten behind because you had all your early game, and then you just like have a disjointed game. And you don't always have the most control over this, but you can kind of have an idea of what your deck is trying to accomplish. Like, oh, I'm trying to get in a little bit of damage early, and then I have this big flyer that I'll eventually hope to draw and win the game with. Or, oh, I have a few card draw spells and I'll pull ahead with those. Or, oh, my deck has 7 removal spells in it. I'm just going to play my game and then be able to kill whatever big things my opponent plays. So just have some sort of plan. And generally, if you are trying to build an aggressive sealed pool, try not to mix or mix too much with the slow elements that are often going to be found in sealed, because you're just going to draw your slow cards when you really need a fast card, and that's going to end badly. Next, remember, every build will involve some trade-offs. You're not always going to have the perfect mana curve. You're not always going to have as many removal spells as you want. You maybe don't get to play every single great card that you opened in your sealed pool, but there are going to be trade-offs involved with every build. And so just do your best and don't sweat it if you don't get to do check off every single box of the things that I've mentioned. And then finally, you can learn as you go. So just do your best. You can make changes between rounds in a pre-release. You can make sideboarding changes between games if you want in a pre-release. So you don't have to be perfect right off the bat. You can definitely make changes over time, because it's a casual level event. And so between rounds, you can make tweaks to your deck. You can rebuild your deck. You can learn from things as you go, especially because nobody's been really played with the cards before at the pre-release. And so you're going to be learning a lot of new things as you play with your deck. Next thing, sealed versus draft. If you have played draft before, or you've heard people talking about draft, here are some key differences between sealed and draft so that you can know as you're evaluating cards, oh, this card looks really good in draft. What do I think of it for sealed? First up, sealed is slower because you don't have as much control over your mana curve in sealed. You're not going to open the tools to have a consistent curve out as often. So you are going to be playing slower games, which means card advantage gets a little bit better, and random like early drop creatures that fall off a cliff in the late game get a little bit worse. Though there are still occasionally going to be pools you open where there are aggressive decks, it is going to be slower on average. Next up, sealed has lower synergy. We already covered this because you're opening 6 random packs and you don't get to draft your cards to try and build synergy. You're going to have lower synergy on average. So cards that might be good in a draft format where you're like, wow, this card's going to be really good when I build around it a little bit, are going to get a little weaker in sealed. And then 3, sealed has more bombs. And a bomb is like a late game rare usually that's going to vastly swing the game, because when players are opening 6 booster packs, they're going to, and playing the best cards that they open in their booster packs as they're doing a sealed pool, they're going to be opening 6 boosters instead of 3, which you would open in a draft. And so you just have twice as many opportunities to open up a really strong rare. And also when you're building in sealed, you open up all 6 packs right off the bat. So you're like, okay, I'm going to be playing my best cards from these. So you can generally expect to face a couple of really strong cards from each of your opponents. And so just keep that in mind. And particularly, it means you should save your removal when you can, because maybe in draft, you kill a creature, keep applying pressure, but in sealed, once again, it's slower and there are a lot of bombs. So you can be like, well, my opponent hasn't played anything crazy yet, but they probably will in the future because sealed does have more bombs. And then the final tips before we close this off. First, 1, read the cards carefully. A pre-release is with brand new cards from a new Magic the Gathering set, and you want to make sure you read the cards carefully. Make sure that all of the cards that you think you can cast at instant speed are actually instants. That's definitely something that happens all the time where you're like, oh, I thought this was an instant when it's actually a sorcery. Make sure when your opponent plays a card, you take the time to read it if you don't know what it does, because sometimes your opponent, just because they haven't played with the cards either, will sometimes misplay one of their cards. So just make sure you read the cards, understand the board state, don't fall for any creatures that have reach when you don't think they have reach or something like that, and you'll be much happier. Number 2, be prepared to make sideboard adjustments. If you are playing a deck in Sealed, you have opened 6 packs, so you generally have a lot of extra cards to choose from, or maybe some more niche cards that like destroys an artifact or an enchantment or things like that. So between games, you can make adjustments to your deck to help yourself in games 2 and 3. Or if your opponent's playing like a fast deck, you can use your sideboard to make your deck a little bit quicker yourself by siding in some of the bad early plays that maybe you didn't want to play. Or you can sideboard in more card draw if you're in a late game battle and you don't need some of the more early game plays that maybe are a little bit weaker in the matchup. Be prepared to make those adjustments. And then number 3, other players often love to look at your deck and help, particularly if you are less experienced and you're playing against someone who's more experienced. You can, if you lose like the round to them, you can be like, hey, could you take a look at my deck and see if you have any suggestions for me? That's something that people love to do. People love being able to talk about the decks, talk about the cards, and that's something that you shouldn't be embarrassed or something to ask somebody for help, because players really do like making the experience great for everybody, providing some tips, helping you improve as a player. That's something that a lot of players really do enjoy, and a lot of the time they will be happy to look at your deck, be like, oh, maybe you should consider playing this card because I think this one's really good, and maybe you should cut this card because it's a little bit weaker, and they give you things to talk about. And that's one of the benefits of playing at a pre-release, where people are having fun trying the new cards and just having a good time playing Magic. That's going to do it for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback, and leave hashtag pre-release ready in the comment section down below, because hopefully you now feel prepared to go have fun at your next pre-release. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.